right, everybody, I want to show you a little slideshow presentation I put together called Why Should We Even Care? A love story about ellipses and perspectives. So once upon a time, we were dumb, but trying. And this is a great example of a Greek mosaic from the 2nd century where we were trying very hard to approach perspective. And perspective, as you'll recall, is what we just practiced when we were using our 1-point perspective and the vanishing point to create these 3-dimensional shapes that recede into the distance. It's a way of achieving accuracy in your 2-dimensional drawings to create a 3-dimensional look. We did not have it locked down. It's kind of crazy to think that we have all of the history stacked up as artists to refer back to. We've had every cultural phenomenon, every revolutionary technique that was discovered up to this point to refer back to when we're making art. And I think that that's incredible and something that we kind of take for granted. And so I want to show you all these examples of how it sort of has evolved over time. This is a fresco from the Vatican Virgil. This is from about 400 AD. And this shows how these roof beams are kind of starting to converge more or less on a common vanishing point, but they're not systematically related to the rest of the composition, right? They kind of have this oblong, distorted football shape. And like we talked about, the difference between ovals and ellipses and that weird little football shape is an ellipse doesn't have these kind of points. It's a circle that's receding into the distance. So it forms a different kind of shape called the ellipse. Now, there was perspective and experiments happening with perspective in places like China and Japan and India. And this was happening from the 1st or 2nd century till like the 18th century. So this isn't really like new, and it's definitely not partial only to European artists. There are discussions about how, China might have acquired this from India, which had acquired this technique from ancient Rome, but that is just speculation and not necessarily true. A lot of people believe that it's an indigenous invention. Either way, there's this kind of perspective happening where they've figured out that when you're putting something in the far background, it's going to look smaller. And if you're putting something in the foreground and it's up close, it's going to look big. So you're just basically making a 3-dimensional illusion on a 2-dimensional flat surface. And this is one of the techniques used to do that. And before that, the ancients were making their attempts as well. There's some ancient Greek red pottery paintings. And these represent illusionism, which was an attempt at creating depth and the illusion of depth, mostly used in theater. There's a geometric theory of perspective that was called scenographia. And this is not just used on the stage, but also used in some paintings. This is it's kind of a really simplistic way of creating proportion. But this was also a technique of hierarchy, showing who is dominant under and who works underneath them by having the large figures versus the smaller figures. I'm sure some of you have seen Egyptian hieroglyphs where it shows the leader and the ruler, the emperor, is always larger and unproportionately larger than his subjects. So along came Filippo Brunelleschi, and he came around 1452 and 1420 when he was making these experiments to draw these various Florentine buildings with an exact perspective. He had a lot of help from his friend Toscanelli, who was a mathematician. He just didn't publish any of the mathematics behind the perspective. Then later, there was another friend of Brunelleschi's. His name was Alberti. He wrote De Pictura, which is talks about the proper methods of showing distance in painting. So this is kind of the beginning of how to break down the mathematics of perspective drawing so that you can accurately draw these buildings. And then that spreads into paintings. There's the use of perspective that becomes incredibly prominent in Florence, especially during the Renaissance in the 1400s, 1500s. You start to see these kind of different uses of perspective. Like this is kind of more of a radial perspective, and it's got a center focal point, right? And then all of these little objects, these would be like your blocks, your block buildings, kind of receding off into the vanishing point to create this illusion that we're looking up into the sky through like a dome, through a circle. And then this is an example of Melozzo de Forlì and his upward foreshortening techniques. Hey, go back. Hold on. As you can see, the vanishing point would be off the page. And it's kind of this exaggerated foreshortening where you're looking at it from below, like an ant's eye view versus a bird's eye view. And he also started the Forlì School in Florence, where students were coming to practice and learn underneath him these techniques of perspective. And I really like this example of Melozzo's work because we're talking about ellipses, and I'm really obsessed with ellipses because, like I've said before, you're drawing boxes, that's pretty typical, pretty like structured, but the more organic shapes, trying to get those into perspective requires a lot of like teaching your brain to not be loosey-goosey about it and forcing yourself to kind of like sit with it and actually think about how perspectively accurate is the circle that I'm drawing. And this is a great example of a circle that Melozzo was drawing or painting, and the way he pays attention to how the circle gets stretched into an ellipse when it recedes into the background, right? It's not a flat circle. It has this long axis, and then its short axis is down here, right? And it's fatter, it's wider at the base, and then it recedes and gets skinnier and leaner and more stretched toward the back. Right. So these are just important techniques. Leonardo da Vinci came along as well, and he was emphasizing the concepts of Da Vinci Piero della Francesca and the books that he had written, the different theories that he was practicing, and the mathematics of this kind of drawing. He really summarized the use of perspective in his paintings. He used one-point perspective as well as shallow focus. Della Francesca was the first person to accurately draw the Platonic solids as they would appear in perspective. So they're kind of working with this really mathematical sense of perspective and how to get proportions just right. And this is obviously the Vitruvian Man. I'm sure many of you recognize it. Albrecht Dürer was responsible for, he's kind of like coined as the first person who demonstrated two-point perspective. He was working primarily in etching. And here's kind of an example of like the looseness that perspective can appear. So we have these 2 points, the sun and the moon, and then all of these main characters kind of diverting into that. So From there, I mean, perspective has just been used again and again and again to today with artists who are kind of, you know, learning the rules of drawing, and perspective is such a key role. And then kind of manipulating it into whatever style they have. Like, obviously, this is not a picture perfect, you know, photorealistic, naturalistic image of a family at dinner. She got to apply her own style and her own techniques to these paintings, but she very carefully and wisely followed these rules that we've been studying in proportion. And so did artists like Christina Wang. Like, she's doing something very modern, right? She's making a painting that kind of pokes fun at meme culture, but she's also following these very ancient traditional rules about following line and using perspective to create shapes with accuracy. So that leads us to our project for today. We're going to be working with cross contour lines to create simple shapes and then more complex shapes. But this is a great way to break down what you're looking at and how to replicate it. And there's a video tutorial that will come with it, but I wanted to do a quick brief overview showing you guys this kind of reduction of the shape of an apple, or in this case, probably a watermelon, into these ellipses. So you have these ellipses that go horizontally, ellipses that go vertically, and they obey that cone of vision. They don't extend past what you wouldn't be able to see if you were looking at something head on. So you'll be making apples today. And someday you can apply this kind of logic to creating more complex drawings. And I want you guys to be paying really close attention to where the shadows are and where the light is on your drawings. I think value is something that we'll keep revisiting throughout this class, but I can't stress its importance enough. It's when you're looking at the value scale of an object, going from light to dark. Let me grab an apple for demonstration's sake. So I see there's shadows down here, there's shadows over here, there's a great big white highlight over here, and then there's middle ranges in between. I would want to capitalize on using these different gradations from darkest to light with my pencil, with my graphite, with my charcoal, to kind of make sure that after I've done a basic drawing of this, I could go back in and shade wherever I see darks, wherever I see middle grounds, wherever I see really light areas. And something to consider is this process of cross contour drawing is a lot like working with cross hatching, like you remember working with cross hatching in our other exercises. If you look at this, you can see that yes, there's been some shading done with a blending stump, but also there's this kind of convergence, this kind of coming together of the lines in the areas where it's the darkest, right? So I'll highlight that, like right here. That isn't just dark because they filled in with a charcoal pencil. It's dark too because they've pushed and squeezed their lines together. And I think this really shows up clearly on this drawing when you look in areas such as up here at the top, where the apple would become a little bit darker. You would see that kind of pit of shadow. That was goth, because there are all these little dark lines converging together. It makes it look as though it is getting darker, but it's actually because it's following the, like, I don't know, the perspective lines of where your eye is going. And it's happening down here too. And it's something that's just so much easier to express visually than it is in words. But I hope that you guys are inspired by this kind of attention and intention for where they're putting and drawing their lines. All right. And then there's another example. This is one where it's just the horizontal ellipses. You can click here for the assignment. It'll lead to a YouTube page. I'll just post that up in the announcement. And then if you get done early or you want to challenge yourself, you've maybe done this apple exercise 100 times, so you did it really fast and you want to challenge yourself a little bit more, you can go in and try to do a cross contour drawing of a face. I chose a former Democratic leader because I think this is an interesting time where we're so focused on democracy, and I was just doing a little bit of research and I found it very interesting, but you can choose whoever's face you want to replicate, of course. Okay, get to work.